Thank you, Karin, and all the organizers for having invited me here, and thank you for your attention. So I will talk about neuroethics and philosophy in responsible research and innovation. I will try to be quite short in order to maybe allow more discussion if you would like. So this is the outline of what I'm going to present. I will start from a kind of textbook definition of RRI. Then I will focus specifically on the concept of responsibility, which is presupposed, we can say, in the definition of RRI. Then I will say something about the most important component of RRI and also the limitations of the definition of RRI. And then I will specifically focus on reflexivity. This is the philosophical part, we can say, of the presentation. And then I will give you a couple of illustrative examples of RRI, specifically of the connection between philosophy and RRI, referring to fundamental neuroethics, which is what with my group I'm trying to develop, and then to consciousness, which is the actual topic of my research. What I will present is basically described in this paper we recently published with my group. And so if you would like to give further look to what I'm going to say, you can refer to this paper, which has been published this year. So we can start from a kind of textbook definition of RRI, which can be defined as the interactive process that engages social actors, researchers, and innovators who must be mutually responsive and work towards the ethical permissibility of the relevant research and its products. So we will try to unpack this definition. So for starting, we should focus on the basic requirement of interaction. Interaction between researchers, of course, but also between who is involved specifically on the technological side of research, and also other social actors who can be lawyers or sociologists, but also philosophers, as we will see. So the basic, the fundamental element, we can say, of RRI is interaction. So now we go back to interdisciplinarity. So the need for involving different backgrounds in analyzing the possible, we can say, extra scientific impact of science. So what science can mean for people outside science, for the society in large. So we have two elements, one important element to outline in RRI, and this is what I'd like to stress specifically, the fact that RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation, which by the way is a framework explicitly required, for instance, by the European Commission in the research funded by the European Commission. So you need to refer and as much as possible to respect, we can say, the RRI framework. So an important element is that RRI is not only focused on the impact of research and innovation, but it should also take into account the background conditions of research and innovation. This is the most philosophical part I'd like to discuss with you. So I think it's time to go beyond a simplistic approach to RRI, which reduces RRI to just an analysis of the practical implication. But we need to also focus on what is behind science in a way. So what is the real inspiration of science? Why science does what it does? So what is the real, we can say, inspirational idea of science? In textbook, you find these elements of RRI. So you find anticipation, inclusiveness, responsiveness, reflexivity. So science should, I mean, RRI, if you want to be responsible, you should anticipate the possible impact of your research. And you also should try to include other people in analyzing this impact. Of course, you should be responsive, so you should react in a proper way to what are the implications of your research. But there is also an important component, which is reflexivity. Reflexivity means that you need to think about, very simply put, you need to think about what are the implications of your science. So the point is that scientists cannot be just focused on his work, but he needs to enlarge the scope, we can say, to think about what this work imply for the society at large. But also, he needs to think about the reason why he does his research, why you focus on this problem, for instance, why you approach this problem in this specific way. So what is your inspiration? And this is unpacked in the philosophical components of RRI. So what is specifically the role of philosophy within the RRI framework? What can philosophy give to the discussion about RRI? Reflexivity is, of course, the field of philosophy, because philosophy as a discipline is about reflection, is about conceptual analysis. And so, of course, philosophy is relevant to RRI, but I'd like to focus on a specific example, which is the definition of responsibility. To define responsibility, of course, philosophy is highly relevant, because philosophy, as I told you, is a conceptual analysis. So if you want to define something, philosophy can help us, of course. And so within the framework of RRI, philosophy can help us to unpack the meaning of responsibility. And we can have, very simply described, we can have a couple of meaning of responsibility. An individualistic meaning of responsibility versus a social meaning of responsibility. What does this mean? You can define responsibility as something that has to do with the individual behavior, so something related to the subject in itself. So you are responsible, for instance, of what you do in your lab because you are a moral subject in a way. So you are individually responsible for what you do. And this is the individual meaning of responsibility. But there is also a social meaning of responsibility. So regardless of what is your definition of morality, for instance, you have the responsibility towards the society in which you live. So you are responsible as a citizen. It doesn't matter what you think about morality. You are, of course, responsible by law, for instance, to respect specific rules. So this is a social responsibility. But social also means that there is kind of shared responsibility. So we are all responsible. So responsibility is not only something individual, but is something of a group of, for instance, scientists. So it's for instance, a responsibility of a lab groups, or responsibility of a society, a scientific society, and so on. So it's a broader meaning of responsibility, something we share with others. Concerning, and this is something I would like to discuss with you, concerning the responsibility of scientists, usually, there is a trend to think that scientists are not ethically responsible for the impact, we can say the uses or misuses of their findings. Usually, we are prone to think that this responsibility lies on the shoulders of politicians, for instance. Other people, not scientists. Scientists just are asked to do research, to do science. It doesn't matter what are specifically the implication of their research. They just do science, and science, there are some extreme view according to which science is ethically neutral. It doesn't anything to do with ethics. While, as I told you, policymakers are responsible to assess the impact of science. Well, this view is not so much compatible with the RRI framework, because RRI aims to give a more holistic view, we can say, of responsibility. So also scientists are in this sense responsible, because science is in itself socially, of course, relevant and also has ethical implication. But I understand this is a very controversial topic. So the main point here is whether science is something that has to do as such with ethics, or ethics is something that is in a way added from the outside to science. So is science something intrinsically ethically relevant or not? And are scientists ethically responsible of what they do or not? Or responsibility is just something that we as, for instance, policymaker have in reflecting on science. So that's a very important point. Anyway, the RRI framework aims to give a more, I repeat, a more holistic approach to responsibility. In fact, according to the RRI framework, responsibility and no responsibility are in a way distributed throughout all the process of research and innovation. So the first distinction was between the individualistic and the social responsibility, but we have also another possible distinction between the forward-looking and the collective responsibility. Forward-looking is very important because it's usually when we talk about people responsible for something, we think about what we already done in a way. So you are responsible for what you did, for instance, yesterday or the day before, and so on. So it's a back look in a way. You look at what is already done and you are responsible for that. Of course, this is a possible meaning of responsibility, but there is also another meaning in a way open to the future. So you are responsible for what, not for what you did, but for what you will do in a way. And this is important within the framework of RRI. So scientists are called to think about and to be responsible not only of what they already done, but also what they can do, so about the future. An important premise of all I already told you is that science is a social enterprise. So it's a social, we can say, activity. It's something, of course, part of a society. So science is not something disconnected, of course, from society. This is something quite, we can say, obvious, but not so obvious. Anyway, the fact that science is intrinsically a social activity has at least three consequences. First of all, other stakeholders, so people outside science, should strive to understand science. So if we want to discuss about the social implication, for instance, of science, first of all, we need to try as much as we can to understand what scientists say in order to avoid misunderstanding. So we cannot discuss about science without trying to hear, to read, to listen to scientists and to know what they want to say about specific issues. So this is a requirement, a necessary requirement. Another implication of the fact that science is a social enterprise is that science should enhance inclusive and collaborative relationship with the rest of society. So science should become something as much as possible inclusive. So should improve the involvement of other stakeholders in discussion and analysis of problems. I repeat, as much as possible, because of course, if you have high specialization, you cannot think to involve people who are not expert enough. But anyway, as much as possible, science should strive for involving other people in discussions and analysis. And so we have a mutual relationship between science and social context, different kind of social context. So this is the point, to think about science as component of a broader picture, which is society, and try to improve the relationship between science and other social contexts that can be on different kind, of course. So here we arrive to an important point, which is the need for a multidisciplinary approach in order to reflect on goals and values. I would like to stress different elements of this point. First of all, multidisciplinarity. We just discussed about interdisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity is a bit different than interdisciplinarity. Maybe sometimes we do not clearly distinguish between the two meanings. Interdisciplinarity, in my view, of course, means that you approach something from a kind of neutral view. So it's interdisciplinarity because you are not specifically located, so to say, in a discipline. So you are in the middle of different disciplines. Multidisciplinarity means something different because multi means more than one, and so you have different disciplines thinking about a problem, an issue. So you have different point of view on a problem. This is different than interdisciplinarity because in interdisciplinarity you have something which cannot be really analyzed from a specific point of view, but in itself require the involvement of different disciplines. Think about consciousness, for instance, which will be the illustrative case I will give you in a moment. You cannot think to solve the problem of consciousness just from one disciplinary point of view. By the way, maybe you cannot think to solve the problem of consciousness at all. But anyway, if you just want to approach consciousness from one perspective, you cannot really definitely fix the problem. You need, why? Because consciousness in itself is impossible to describe just from one discipline, because in the case of consciousness, you have a first-person perspective as you have a third-person perspective. So you have sides of the problem which cannot be really managed from just one discipline. Because, of course, physics is highly relevant, but it is highly relevant just to describe the third-person perspective of consciousness. So you have psychology, which is highly relevant for the first-person perspective. And so neither psychology or physics are in themselves enough to solve the problem. So this is, in my view, of course, interdisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity means the involvement of more than one discipline, and in this case, it's important we need the RRI framework to involve different disciplines to think about goals and values of science. What is the goal of scientific research? And what are the values inspiring this research? So what is behind, we can say, science? Because I already told you that. So we can okay, so that was what I think is the core of RRI, the need for a multidisciplinary approach about the goals and values of science. Of course, there are limitations of RRI. We can discuss a lot about the fact that RRI is limited, that maybe RRI is not something that we can really realize, is not something that we can really employ in reality. And we have different problems I just list some of them. The definition of RRI that I gave you at the very beginning is criticized because it risks to be an open-ended definition, so a bit vague, not so concrete. And also some features of RRI are not clear, so they are conceptually unclear. So the very definition of RRI is, in this sense, not very well established. And of course, the implementation is very complicated. That's out of question. Of course, these problems should not stop us thinking about RRI and trying to implement an RRI framework. Okay, now I'd like to focus specifically on the reflexivity component of RRI. And I like to stress that with reflexivity, we should mean an analysis of assumptions and consequences of research, and so also reflexivity implies and needs a multidisciplinary approach. And in this analysis of assumptions and consequences of research, philosophy is highly relevant because philosophy can give you an analysis of basic scientific and also ethical, of course, concepts. So in this sense, I assume philosophy as, we can say, an analysis of language. So what is the meaning of the categories used by scientists? So what do scientists mean using specific words, for instance? What's the meaning of the main, we can say, the main words used in scientific research? So in this sense is a linguistic explanation. And in this way, philosophy can help to build a bridge between scientists and folk, we can say folk people, I mean, not scientifically educated people. So it can help scientists also to talk with the rest of society. So philosophy as a kind of, I repeat, a linguistic analysis. But of course, in the framework of RRI, philosophy also becomes an ethical analysis, of course. So the aim of the involvement of philosophy in the framework of RRI is to open new space of reflection. So to help scientists to think about the possible new perspectives on the problems they are approaching. So it's a kind of provoking exercise in a way to push scientists to think differently on what they are exploring. So an attempt to open new doors, to open new perspectives. So it's a creative exercise. Maybe it's too much optimistic, but I see philosophy within the RRI framework as an attempt to think differently, so to open new, I repeat, open new doors. This can be helpful for science because I think that philosophy, so understood, can help science to enhance a kind of self-critical analysis, because a conceptual clarification can help science to think better about itself, to refine, for instance, its categories, and also to better use its concept. So, a conceptual clarification is always a good thing, isn't it? So, in this way, science can be helped by philosophy. I don't know if I'm too much optimistic. We can discuss it later. But my view is to think philosophy as a kind of help for science. And of course, philosophy can give science the necessary tools to evaluate the ethical implication of science. That's out of question. So philosophy can give scientists that we can say conceptual instruments to see and to analyze the ethical concerns. So in this view, philosophy is not just kind of analysis of practical implication. That's, I mean, reductive. It's not just an analysis of possible, we can say, ethical impact of science. It's not just that. It's an attempt to collaborate with science, to refine its categories in order to better analyze what does science mean for society and what are the implications of science. It's not just a police tool used to control science. It's something more sophisticated. It's a way to better refine scientific approach to different topics, to different issues, and to better view the possible implication of this analysis. So it's not just applied ethics, or even worse, a misguided applied ethics. It's something more. Philosophy is not reduced to, I repeat, to a control of science.
May I ask, what do you mean by
misguided? Misguided, I mean...
Because you really emphasized.
with misguided, I mean the application of supposedly objective criteria or values in order to judge, to analyze what scientists do. So it's a kind of application of ethical values, supposedly objective and absolutely good, in order to analyze the implication of science. So it's a view from the top down, we can say. So I know what is good, and with this knowledge I judge what scientists do. So in this sense it's misguided, because I don't think this is effective and this is a good approach. Of course, I'm simplifying a lot the discourse, so if you have problems and questions, we can discuss. So, as I already told you, in this way, philosophy risks to be reduced to a kind of tool in the hands of police to, analyze and control science. That's not what I mean. And I give you a couple of illustrations. The first is fundamental neuroethics. I don't know how many of you have heard about neuroethics, which is now kind of established disciplines. So neuroethics is the application of ethical theory and ethical analysis to neuroscientific issues. And so the analysis of the impact of neuroscience on the ethical problems. But there is a tendency in the neuroethics discussion to reduce neuroethics just to the analysis of the ethical issues raised by neuroscience. So again, to reduce neuroethics to applied ethics. With my group, we are trying to do something theoretically more intriguing. And we try to develop a neuroethics which we define fundamental, because we assume it as a conceptual analysis of foundational notions of neuroscience in order to provide the background, the necessary background for examining the potential impact of neuroscience on different topics. So what I mean is that in this perspective, neuroethics is a conceptual analysis of what is presupposed by the neuroscientific research. So again, of the categories used by neuroscientists. Categories that often are just taken for granted by scientists, because they just use them, we can say, instinctively. They just use them as a kind of something not deserving further reflection. But we try to reflect on these categories. We try to to collaborate, of course, with neuroscientists. By the way, the majority of the papers we publish is in collaboration with scientists, with neuroscientists. And so we try to find a kind of shared view on topics, starting from this conceptual analysis. So in this sense, we stress, the need for an interdisciplinary and a multidisciplinary approach again. So this was the first illustrative case, and it's about fundamental neuroethics. The other is about consciousness. As I already told you, consciousness is something as such needing both, we can say, an empirical and a conceptual approach. I mentioned you the first person perspective and the third person perspective on consciousness. From the first person perspective, I can say I am aware of something and I can describe you what I'm aware of. From the third person perspective, I can, for instance, monitor the brain through neuroimaging, for instance, and I can say, well, now specific regions of your brain are more active than others, so I can infer that you are thinking about this or that. I'm simplifying a lot, of course, but the point is that I can identify brain signatures of conscious experiences, and so I have a third person approach to consciousness, because an observer can infer your conscious experiences through the visualization of your brain activity. There is no an agreement about the definition of consciousness. Yesterday at dinner, I don't remember the name of that guy, but yesterday at dinner we were together, and when I told him I'm studying consciousness, he told me, well, you can have 10 people in a room, and in the end you have more than 10 definitions of consciousness. Sure, that's true. In fact, we lack a shared definition of consciousness. It's something that we do not have yet. Maybe we will never have it. So this is the theoretical side of the problem. But on the empirical side, we have more agreement about the so-called neural correlates of consciousness, so the brain signatures of consciousness. With neural correlates of consciousness, we can understand the minimal neuronal activation necessary for consciousness, for conscious experiences. This is not the place where to go into details, but anyway, what I'm trying to say you is that consciousness is something conceptually very hot and very problematic, but the empirical research, of course, did a lot of great success, and so we know a lot now about the third person perspective on consciousness. We can distinguish between, for instance, the correlates of the state of consciousness and the correlates of the contents of consciousness. So with state of consciousness, I mean being versus not being conscious at all. So this is the wakefulness. And with the contents of consciousness, I mean the awareness. So being conscious of something specific. But anyway, we still lack an overarching theory of consciousness. So why did I mention consciousness as an illustrative case? Well, in my work within the fundamental neuroethics research, I specifically approached consciousness, and I tried to suggest a model which we can call intrinsic consciousness theory. And I published this paper a couple of years ago together with Stephen Lowris, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, and my supervisor, who is a philosopher. So in this paper, we tried to employ an interdisciplinary approach to consciousness. And in the end, I suggested a model. Now it's not important to go into my model of consciousness. What I try to illustrate you is that some problems needs an interdisciplinary approach, a multidisciplinary also approach, and the final result can be analyzed within the framework of RRI. By the way, this is my model. I'd like to skip it now. If you are interested, we can discuss later. And I jump to the conclusion. According to my model, and this is the point relevant to RRI, the brain is ethically relevant not only for what it does at the aware level. So not only what we can say consciously is important and ethically relevant, but also the unconscious level is ethically relevant. And so this is important for extreme cases like disorders of consciousness. If you have vegetative state patients, for instance, of course, the conscious activities are highly damaged. Maybe you don't have any residual aware activities. But does this mean that these patients are not ethically relevant? Of course, we instinctively say no, but we should substantiate this no with arguments. And according to my model, if we think about the ethical relevance of the brain as connected to, for instance, experiencing well-being or to having interest, we have empirical research showing that at the unconscious level, our brain is able to experience, we can say, interest and well-being. So if we say that someone is ethically relevant as much as he feels interest or well-being, and we also say, and we also know from empirical science that also our unconscious is able, so to say, to feel interest and well-being, then we should conclude that also unaware people are ethically relevant. I don't know if it's clear, my reasoning. What I'm trying to say is that when we start from premises, we should be aware of the fact that these premises can be framed within different disciplinary perspectives. And so we should be aware of different points of view on that premises. In the case of this model of consciousness, if I conclude that also unaware abilities are ethically relevant, then I can think of new allocation of resources, for instance, for people in disorders of consciousness. If I have people in vegetative states, for instance, and I conclude that these people are able to unaware experience good or bad experiences, then maybe I should take care of their environment more than now. So I should be aware of the need for giving different healthcare assistance, for instance. Okay, now I conclude with take-home messages. So RRI is an interactive process, so it's something asking for a collaboration between different points of view. We need to enlarge the focus of RRI. It's not just a reflection about the implication of science. Of course, it is also this, but it's also, in my view, a reflection about we can say, the inspiration of science. What's the reason behind the scientific work? What's the goal? And what are the values inspiring scientific research? Their responsibility needs to be enlarged, so we need to think about responsibility not just as refer to the past, but mainly to the future. So what are the future implications of research? And also not only something as individually defined, but also involving other people. So we need a multidisciplinary approach, and philosophy, from my point of view, is highly relevant as much as it is understood not just as a a police tool, as something that from the outside is judging what scientists are doing, but as a collaborative effort to unpack the meaning of scientific concepts and language. So, yeah, thank you for your attention.